We ready to go? Hi, everybody. Grab your trail mix. This is going to be fun. This is actually one of the most interesting sessions in this entire Aspen Security Forum, and I'm so excited for it. Of course, I ask on your behalf the commander of NORAD about whether anything in this panel and what all of you are doing, which we get into, is of any benefit to him, and he loved it. So, but let me tell you who we have here. Our title of this panel is Imagining the Next 9/11, which we discussed just shortly ago. What future scenario should scare us most, and what can we do to prevent it from coming true? And we have an extraordinary group of out-of-the-box thinkers, writers, creatives, and even in uniform, which is, you know, the whole idea of creative in uniform is growing up as an Air Force dependent is somewhat complicated for me, but I'm willing to go with it. But we'll get there. But we have with us Peter Singer, who's a strategist. He's a senior fellow at New America. But more importantly, he's the author of a fantastic book. And one of my first exposés in this kind of topic was Ghost Fleet, which, if you haven't read it, just breathe, because it is just packed with trauma after trauma that we face, and so I kind of get where we're going. But I just want to commend him for that. But he is an author of many, many other books in this as well. We have Miriam Krieger, who is a permanent professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy, and she is also the head of the Department of Political Science. And it's a real pleasure to have you with us. And I should know you, Colonel. Is Colonel? So, yeah, it didn't say that here, but I'm bad at insignia, so Colonel Krieger. So Colonel Krieger, great to see you. And then we have Daniel Wilson, who's an author and screenwriter at Iron Cloud Entertainment. Great to see you, and you're also very active, very creative in this space. And so let me just open up, and I'm going to start with Peter. My earliest memory is, I don't know if you heard the last panel, being, you know, working for Arnold Horlick at the Rand Corporation on Soviet stuff, was Tom Clancy's book, Hunt for Red October. And at that time, people became convinced that our intelligence community had that book written so that we could teach the Soviets how to defect and give us a submarine. But that was, there were articles along those lines. And of course, there have been, David Ignatius, who's been with us, of course, from the Washington Post, has written extraordinary novels in national security. And I've always sort of felt when I read a David Ignatius novel, I was getting something secret 6 months before it was going to go public. So I guess I just want to ask you, Peter, to sort of talk to us about this project you call useful fiction and how it's applied to national security, who the players are in it, and I want you to just mesmerize our audience.
Thank you, and thank you for the book sale pitch. So the concept of useful fiction is a deliberate blend of nonfiction research and analysis, but shared through narrative. So a different way of thinking about it is...
So is that like Michael Crichton, Jurassic Park, and
no,
DNA?
No, I'm going to get to this.
Dinosaurs?
So it's like what I do to my kids, where I sneak fruit and vegetables into their smoothies, except we're doing it for policymakers. So at one end of the spectrum, you have your Crichton, you have your Clancy. It's like a milkshake. It's designed for entertainment. Now there may be some good stuff in there, you know, like a strawberry milkshake, but at the end of the day, it's designed for entertainment. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got your white paper, your strategy paper, your war game report. It's important, but it's hard to get people to read it. It's hard to get them to visualize it. And so what useful fiction is it's deliberately starting with the nonfiction research, but sharing it through a story. So, you know, you mentioned Ghost Fleet. We did that where it was research on a lot of the issues that we've talked about today, great power competition with China, supply chain security. But rather than sharing it through a nonfiction book, we shared it through a novel, but a novel with 27 pages of research and notes. And what this project that we're here to talk about is basically taking that, but applying it to some real world problems today. We had a cooperative with the Homeland Defense Institute at the Air Force Academy. And one of the big things that they were concerned about is, and this is something that's come up again, is how do we avoid that 9/11-like moment, not specifically 9/11, but the way that an organization like Northern Command, like NORAD, thought, and much of us here as well, thought the world worked on September 10th, and then September 11th, it was a very different world.
So am I allowed to talk about some of the essays I read or not?
Let me give I'll give you the setting for them, and then you've got
Dan, who wrote one of them.
Yeah.
Did you write the one about the colors of the water in Washington? No. Okay.
That was
that was you.
Yeah.
Oh, that was such a grim and dark and depressing. You know, I always expect in the movies you get the grim and the dark, awful scenario, but the hero comes and saves the day at the end. You have no hero in yours.
So let me give
I mean, fill this out for people so it's not an inside baseball thing.
Yeah,
and I asked folks if I could talk about it because I read it under embargo, and I didn't know if I could mention these scenarios yet. So if you reveal it, then you're legal, right?
Well, yeah, so I'll give the background to the project, and then we've got some of the creators of it here. So the idea was that we worked with Air Force officers and subject matter experts, like my colleagues up here on stage, to identify what concerned them the most and what were they finding it challenging to get policymakers to pay attention to. We broke it down into 5 different areas: nuclear, cyber, bio, great power competition, and domestic extremism. And then we paired up those subject matter experts with great writers who then took that real-world information and turned it into compelling scenarios so that it makes it real for people, helps them understand it. Very real. And so you've got 2 folks who worked on it here.
I want to jump to, I want to get to you, Colonel, but I want to go to Dan. Dan, you work in gaming industry, right? You've done scenarios for, you know, entertainment firms.
Yeah, I have done some of that a little bit.
I just want to explain, you're not a military person.
No, I'm not from the military strategic world. Yeah. Well, in fact, the last novel I wrote was a sequel to Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain, so I worked with the state. So I'm familiar with that kind of technical science fiction writing. Yeah.
And so in your role, can you tell us a little bit from being a participant in this, you know, some about, and working with Miriam Krieger, but, you know, kind of what some of the other players in this are doing. What are your North Stars in telling those stories? And I guess useful fiction, I would also ask the question, how do you make it relevant in a way? It's another word for useful, but I know that if you know, Mark Warner will be here tomorrow, Senator Mark Warner, and Senator Warner is very wrapped up in lots of questions about cyber and governance and the stability of our systems and concerns about threats from abroad. So if you were writing for Senator Mark Warner, who has a little bit of an attention distraction issue because he's, you know, how would you get him riveted to what you're doing?
Well, I mean, so I write science fiction to make people excited and interested in what I'm writing, and I come from a robotics background. So before I became a science fiction author, I just loved science fiction enough to go get a PhD in robotics at the Carnegie Mellon Robotics Institute. So when I do write science fiction, I tend to like to play with real toys. You know, I bring in the science fiction.
Did you do iRobot?
I have riffed on iRobot, yeah, in my time. My version is called Robopocalypse. That was my first novel. But so I like to play with these real toys, but what makes people care about science fiction is the human element, right? And so how those 2 things collide is really, I think, what's most interesting and what makes for a compelling read. So my job here was really interesting because I wasn't writing for the Senate, I was writing for Miriam, who's laid out these areas of interest, and I was writing sort of a threat scenario for the military and kind of bringing to bear some extra resources given to me by the military, so analysts that are going to vet this and experts that are going to make sure that all the details are extremely realistic and useful for the person that's digesting this story. And then I'm also bringing my chops as just a science fiction author, as a screenwriter, and also just my attention to detail and my research and technical background.
So Colonel Krieger, I'm just sitting here still somewhat shocked that the head of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy, who drills their students with Clausewitz and Kissinger and all these other strategists, is engaged in creative fiction telling. So I want to ask you, what are the threats that you think are most important, and how are you getting your students to swim in this lane that we're discussing here?
Yeah, I think, so it's particularly interesting. I've had the experience of having to communicate compelling threats all the way from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and that knowledge, skill set, and expertise to an 18-year-old who's still learning how to put on their uniform. And so part of it is capturing their imagination, which is why I found this project really compelling. A good story has a lot in common with a good strategy, which we heard earlier we're not that great at, building those strategists. And so my instinct here is to always ask cadets to spark this imagination and tell a story, right? So one of the things that I asked them, I challenged the room to think of this: how will you know that World War III has started? And I think some people work in top secret SCIFs, and some people work in ops centers monitoring the adversary's every movement. But many of us are gonna find out because we're not gonna be able to get cell phone signal. We're not gonna be able to check out at the grocery store. The ice cream's gonna be melting.
I mean, Twitter went down for a long time the other day. Might that have been the start of World War III?
Sure. I think it will bear out nicely. And in the creative realm, we can actually have that thought experiment and get these 18-year-olds who perhaps don't fully have the experience of, say, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, don't have that relevant strategic knowledge to think creatively. I mean, I was really struck by this discussion of future war and future conflict. Michelle Flournoy is worried about the 2020s and 2030s. Of course, we have concerns, about the 2050s and this brand new force we're going to have, hopefully by then. Well, I'll tell you, I'm teaching right now the captains and majors of the 2020s and 2030s. I'm teaching the generals of the 2050s and 2060s. And so preparing them, not for the analog Air Force and the F-16s that I flew, but rather for this advanced future conflict, creative and innovative force requires some innovative approaches.
Well, along those lines, and I'd ask both Colonel Krieger and Peter this. My understanding, I may have this wrong because your whole field is very new to me, and as I look at it, it was exciting. But I just know that when I want to reach one of the young people I work with, don't ever call them. Text them. I know that if I want to get them to listen something, it's easier for them to do an audio version than to get them to read a paper or a book. Is part of the challenge here, because you're talking about different generations of people that you're reaching, from the chair of the Joint Chiefs, who's General Milley, and he's complicated, and and then an 18-year-old. But is part of what you're doing not just the content, but the delivery and the framework?
I'll hop in. So 100%, and I think that goes, in the classroom for sure. I mean, I always kind of joke that we teach about 50% content, about 40% officership, and about 10% jazz hands, because cadets are tired, and so keeping them awake is part of the job. But I think more than that, the Air Force Academy has really doubled down on this, both through the Homeland Defense Institute, but also through our One Book, One USAFA. It's a fiction book that we've put together. It's a shared read for all of the freshmen. And it's a future conflict-focused science fiction book. And the whole notion there is you need to speak to the people ranging from English majors to engineers.
Right. I should have said I Insta my young people, not message them. But Peter, tell me about how you're. And Peter, my understanding is you've helped build all this out, right?
Yes, and working with a lot of other great people. So let me give you the wonky answer of the value story, and then
you'll give me the Insta version.
Then I'll give you the example of it. So the value of sharing information through a story, first is the science shows that it is a better means for conveying new or complex information, basically based on evolution. When you read a white paper, a memorandum, 2 parts of your brain light up. When the same information is shared through a story, 4 parts of your brain light up. The second value of sharing it through a story is story brings in emotion. And as everyone from a used car salesman to a politician knows, emotion is what drives a sale. The third is the ask. Whether it's a young cadet or a 4-star general, asking someone their busy day to read a story rather than a white paper on X, they're more likely to read the story. You can also reach them in other realms. They'll read it on a weekend and be happy about it. They'll read it on a plane. And then the final thing is that we're humans. We connect over story. So we don't tell our clients this, but people are more likely to talk about a product even if it's bad. We talk about movies that we didn't like, books that we didn't like. In a way, we'll never say, oh, there was this white paper I didn't like. You ought to read it too.
Right.
But let me give you an example that really, this project was taking the most scary scenarios from defense experts, but then having a creative writer turn them into something. And so that's, in a certain way, not to knock Dan, but that's a little bit easy. It's easy to envision, and he should talk about his story, but it's easy.
Which I want him to. I mean, he wrote like a Michael Crichton Jr.
Yeah,
expose.
what a Chinese.
You did like a 2-page, scared the heck out of me. deal that was not a Michael Crichton Jr. thing. You just went bluntly and said, we're screwed.
But like what I'm getting at is the source material of like what would a major Chinese information warfare attack, like you're, okay, we can do that. But let me give you the example that shows how this works in other realms. There was a Australian government white paper on defense education enterprise reform. Now I see everybody quickly Googling, where can I read this? Now, 21 pages, it's obviously important, but how do you get people to engage with it? And so what we did is we worked with them, we identified the 3 key themes of their report, the 37 key nonfiction nuggets, so kind of, what are the vitamins in it? And then we turned it instead into a short story called Eye for a Storm that takes all that but blends it through the story of a young officer as they go from college to a embassy evacuation mission in Jakarta in the wake of a tsunami. And the data showed that we got 15,000 readers of the short story, but to your point, not just youth. Among those readers was the head of the entire Australian military and 6 US 4-star generals and admirals. They're not normally reading white papers on education reform, but we got them through the story. And so that's what this project...
I mean, just back to the Hunt for Red October example, I think it was originally published by the Center for Naval Analyses.
Yeah.
It was not by Harper's or anything. Daniel, would you... So again, well, before we jump, I would love you to tell the scenario you wrote, which is so compelling, and I love it. But and I hope you make it into a movie and all that. But before we do that, I do want to ask about one ethical dimension of this that came to mind, which is you're trying to reach policymakers, and what came to my mind, and we've heard it throughout the Aspen Security Forum, hard choices have to be made, and not everyone agrees. I heard, General Van Herk up here and say, we're getting some stuff wrong because other people see the world differently. They have different priorities. So how do you walk that line that you're not creating a prescriptive course for the policymakers you're reaching, that you're leaving liberty to think about different scenarios? I know you're turning them on to the subject, but it does raise the question that if we tried to take everything that happened in the Aspen Security Forum and create useful fiction around it, we would still have a lot of contentious fiction, right? So, Daniel, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I have a dog in this fight because as a science fiction author, sometimes people expect you to predict the exact future. You're supposed to tell me what's going to happen. And I've always kind of struggled against that because I think my job is to tell a story that's going to allow people to talk to each other and form their own opinions. And so I don't think the goal with writing these threat scenarios is to say, here's exactly what's going to happen and here's exactly how you should respond to it. It's to say, here's a shared sort of cultural context that we can all point to and we can argue about, whether it was realistic, whether they behaved realistically, whether the response was effective.
Can you give our audience a teaser on your great writing?
Just in terms of my threat scenario?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so I focused on a sort of large-scale yet highly targeted mass disinformation campaign that was coming from not just a hacker to sort of steal a little bit of money, but from a state actor that was using it to sort of cripple any sort of response from a larger, from military people. So it kind of was 3 parts. First, it was just classic data mining, so just collecting lots of information about people online, scraping websites, social media, hacks, leaks, but then also building psychographics on these individuals. So this is something that's very common commercially. When you're building an advertisement, you need to know what kind of a person you've got and what they're likely to buy. And switching that over to a sort of a vulnerability is not that big of a difference. The second thing is just using, in this case, it was Pengu Alpha, which is a version of GPT-3 or something similar to GPT-3,
right,
which is a Google AI that's designed to basically solve natural language processing. So it can see some text and then mimic that, and basically creating...
So it's deep fakes.
Yes,
yeah,
and then moving beyond that into general artificial networks, into deep fakes.
Right.
So moving from just text into video, image, audio. So what this ends up being is one morning, 1,000 people get phone calls from their teen children, and their children are threatening self-harm. And they're speaking in a way that's in the kid's voice, because Discord servers have got lots and lots of samples of kids playing video games with each other, and they're saying it in a pacing and the way they would say it. But
Okay,
this is also happening
I just got chills. I just
in
got
1,000
chills.
other ways,
Yeah.
right? So the newscaster that's about to go on gets a text from the bank that her accounts are canceled, you know? And just all these different versions of this, all happening at once, super targeted to individuals and yet happening on a mass scale.
Miriam, I want to hear your scenarios that you and or your students have helped shared short form, because we're running, you know, we got to run on time, but I want you to send chills down my spine also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Dan's story is great, and actually I would even apply it to a military context. One of the things that I worry about is, you know, we as the United States are unlikely to know that war is coming, because the adversary will choose when the conflict occurs. And so if we're lining up, ready to go, just do maybe theater support, like we're doing right now in Eastern Europe or in the South China Sea, and on the eve of the deployment, 5 fighter pilots, 10 logisticians, 12 maintainers all get emails that if they deploy, their accounts at certain banks that target service members and their families will be emptied. And I won't say those banks because I want to get a mortgage from them again someday. But we all know what they're talking about. And so now you have rendered, you know, potentially, right, those forces are going to not want to deploy, likely, because they have families that need to pay mortgages and buy food. If they do deploy, they're going to want assurances that they're not going to be financially destitute when they come back, or that their families are going to be able to pay the mortgage and buy food. So their mind is not going to be in the fight. And you, right, as the commander, now you have a problem, because is this an individual, perhaps, that was a little lax with their passwords? Is this a mass hack of a variety of people, given all of the data that's been leaked or hacked or compromised over the years? Or is this a systemic hack at the financial institution, and now your whole force is potentially subject to this kind of blackmail?
Do you let your cadets go on TikTok?
I don't have the ability to stop them, but it's,
I asked that for reasons. Anybody into TikTok? I'm into TikTok, I admit it. So it's a safe space now. But I mean, going on to TikTok, what you were just talking about, deep fakes and dimensions of that, where you're seeing Tom Cruise. I think Vanity Fair, it may be New Yorker, excuse me if I get it wrong, but it has a story about how this was developed. But when you get in there and you begin looking at the algorithms and what is fed to one, you can create the kind of conditions. May not be 1,000 young people calling about self-harm, but you could create a scenario where the attention of a lot of people is hijacked by something. And it just raises this interesting question about how you navigate that. So Peter, I want you to tell us how to navigate that in less than a few minutes, but at the same time, you wrote a really powerful 2-pager that basically said, you know, your way of informing people is, here's all the stuff that happened, and you implied, and you had a piece of legislation talked about, a resolution about all the stuff that, whereas we didn't do this, whereas we didn't do this, whereas we didn't do this, we must do X. And you said, there's nothing to do because we're already screwed. So I hope I didn't give away the ending. But I'd like you to share with us what you're going to do with your scenario. How will the public come to know some of the things you're doing?
Well, let me go back to what we've just experienced is an illustration of the value of this approach. So the last speaker, the general, talked about how his greatest concern was non-kinetic attacks in the prelude to a potential conflict. What Dan did is took that, worked with experts, and turned it into a story that helped make that kind of wonky description real.
Yeah.
Okay, these are the ways that non-kinetic attacks might play out, targeting, et cetera. And the cool thing, what he didn't talk about, is his story, though, is written from the perspective of a Chinese hacker, sort of going, who's been drawn into it, who's kind of a good guy, bad guy. We don't want to kind of give it too much, but what I'm getting at is, story also allows you to see things from different perspectives. Same thing where you said the project that I did was, and it goes to like something Senator Warner and others have talked about, the next cyber threat hitting Internet of Things, critical infrastructure. We visualized that, but it's written from the perspective of a congressional staffer in the wake of an attack, and you said, oh, it feels bad. The text that ends that story is actually the exact language which was in the legislation immediately after 9/11 with this, you don't want to be the staffer who's writing the legislation afterwards, you want to be the one who's getting ahead of it. So that's what we're going after with the value of story is weirdly, it helps make real the real world issues that we're talking about that it's hard to wrap our heads around.
I guess I want to make sure that our audience knows what to do with this and where to go for more. And my understanding is the technical military term for this now is FICINT, F-I-C-I-N-T. You had to, create an acronym for a really cool thing, didn't you? But so FICINT, or useful fiction, I'd just be interested in if you were to kind of give counsel, Colonel Krieger, to others about what they should read, how can they build upon today's conversations and make it more real, see some of the scenarios that you, your students, Daniel, and others are writing. How can that happen?
Sure, absolutely. So, for one, of course, there's some great and amazing useful fiction out there written by these two gentlemen and others. I'd point you as well to some of the new sci-fi that comes out. I'm a big fan of the Scythe series, actually, that imagines a beneficent AI, utopian world, yet still has problems in the future. If you want a little bit more, if you're not a fiction fan, there's always the opportunity. Sir Lawrence Friedman actually has a great book called The Future of War, A History. And actually, this I think is the most useful piece of this. We, as subject matter experts, tend to be relatively crummy at actually predicting what might happen because we poured in our blinders and our biases based upon our expertise. But the people who are really good are the people who are seeing it from a different perspective. And so while we may not be able to predict the future of conflict, as Sir Lawrence Friedman would have us understand, by reading these stories, we can at least think creatively about it. We can engage more people in the conversation, and we can hopefully be able to see around corners, which is what we actually need in order to survive in the next age.
So we only have like 30 seconds for each of you, but real quick, Miriam, the U.S. Air Force Academy Department of Political Science used to publish, and I don't know if they still do, this great thing, American Readings in National Security. I have like 4 volumes on my shelf. Is there a chance that you're going to take this world of FICINT, some of the work of your people in the scenarios that Dan and Peter are just talking about, and include those next to, I don't know, Bernard Brody?
Yeah, so American Defense Policy, Volume 9 just came out last year, but Volume 10 is already in the works, so we'll see.
Excellent. Well, I think you should say it was mentioned here, and you should tell the publisher to do. Dan, your quick thoughts on what people can do to follow on with you and this field.
I come from outside the military strategic area, but I would just say a lot of the new science fiction that's out there is really great because it moves beyond technological stuff and it's coming from a lot of diverse voices. The technology is just half of it. How people react to it, how it impacts their lives is the other side. And so being able to see a lot of new science fiction coming from really diverse voices has been really exciting for me.
Thank you. And Peter Singer, you buy his books. They're so great. You will not sleep until you're done. But your just quick thoughts on what next.
So I think 2 things. One, for people that are interested in this kind of work and its application to topics that range from war to the future of space, check out useful fiction, Google it. And then the second is there is great value in drinking smoothies. So the idea of both what you drink, getting the good stuff, but also in your reading, you can blend education and entertainment.
So I just want to thank Colonel Miriam Krieger from the Air Force Academy, permanent professor, head of the Department of Political Science. Daniel Wilson, heir to Michael Crichton, cool guy, knows a lot about robot dystopia. And Peter Singer, P.W. Singer, strategist, senior fellow at New American, author of some really incredible, useful fiction. Thank you.
And thank you, Steve Clemons. We're not going to do our closing for the program now. We're going to head over to Greenwald Pavilion where the program's going to start a little bit earlier. Anja will give the closing remarks then. Thank you, and see you down in Greenwald.